Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, a crowd-driven feature where we respond to your questions on everything from history to economics to political philosophy to culture. All those things that concern us in our attempt to live a good life together.
All right, here's one from Andre, and he's asking, can you please explain why the government is in charge of generating and distributing electric power? If it's the usual argument that essential services should not be in private hands, shouldn't we nationalize grocery stores? And why in Ontario do the Liberals want to privatize power generation while the Conservatives want to keep it in state hands?
An excellent question. And of course, when you ask why does the government do something, there are two very different possible answers. One being what is the theoretical justification for it, the other one being what foolishness is this? Now, there is a strong argument for government involvement in the distribution of electric power, and it's the same reason that government has to be deeply involved in the creation of highways, and that is that rights of way need to be settled by public policy because the surface of the earth is two-dimensional. But you can't have competing highway networks because what happens when they hit one another? It doesn't mean the government has to run paving companies. There are all kinds of ways in which various aspects of it can and should be in the hands of the private sector. But ultimately, it's the government that decides where the 401 goes. And in fact, the government, through its power of eminent domain, that is the right to take property, ideally for public use, through due process with just and timely compensation, enables it to expropriate land to build highways. Well, hydro transmission lines are a bit like highways. I mean, yes, I know they're 20, 30 feet in the air, but essentially they're on a network of poles that runs along the surface of the earth. And a private company couldn't build them. It could not get its power to where the customers actually are. That isn't to say that someday there might not be a form of power transmission that wouldn't have this quality. But that's a very real consideration. And so for a while the government was involved, of course, in the distribution of cable television signals, the problem was the cables. It wasn't the customer, it wasn't the creator of the content, it was getting it from point A to point B through these physical wires that had to be put either on poles or in ditches. Once you get satellite TV, the rationale for government involvement disappears. Of course, generally, it disappears a lot faster than the government involvement disappears. But that's power distribution. Why is the government involved in power generation? And there, you could give any number of explanations driven by history, but the fact of the matter is it's not rational to have the government generating power. It is simply not something the government needs to do. It's like grocery stores. Yeah, groceries need to be delivered using trucks on highways to the stores, and you've got to go in your car on a road to get the groceries. But there is no reason why the government should run the supermarket, and we all know what would happen if it did. So why is the government so deeply involved in power generation? Why is the government trying to control the price of power, trying to drive it up and down at the same time? In Ontario, in a wonderful one foot on the brake, one foot on the accelerator process, they invested hugely in alternate energy because they were afraid of global warming. And instead of saying, and you know what I think about global warming, but for the sake of argument, assume it's real. Instead of simply saying you cannot belch carbon dioxide into the air, it's poison, it's pollution, we're all going to die, and letting the power companies figure out what to produce, they decided that the secret was this power that nobody thought was efficient but them because they had superior government insight. And so they started subsidizing windmills and solar power and spent billions of dollars and drove electricity prices sky high and the supply became unreasonable. And they decided to get rid of coal-fired generation. And they decided to get rid of nuclear power because nuclear power is completely environmentally clean and safe, and it's easy to dispose of waste. But radioactivity, the thing about space. So these are good reasons why government...
nuclear accidents are more difficult to deal with than just other things.
Well,
it's
yeah,
scary,
but
obviously.
We've had exactly how many nuclear accidents in Canada.
But still, the possibility is scary.
And you have to take risk into account, yes, and you have to have standards. Again, there is a framework of law, including what dangers you can expose your fellows to, either pollution that's direct harm or the possibility of harm if there's a meltdown. But all of that calls for a proper legal and regulatory regime. It doesn't call for the government to run the power plants any more than the fact that the government has food safety standards means that it should run the farms. And again, government's involved in farming in all kinds of ways in this country, including these wretched marketing boards. So it's very hard for governments to leave things alone even while they should. But at bottom, government needs to have a role in seeing to it that power gets into the grid and gets distributed. But the idea that government should be generating the power is foolishness. And it's a special foolishness because of what has happened. You look at what's happened in Ontario with various government plans to make power cheap and then expensive and do this and do that. They've been messing with the marketplace in ways that have systematically destroyed wealth and created opportunities for this political class to stuff its own pockets. The rate of compensation in the quasi-governmental power agencies in Ontario, and this is not untypical of the world, are enormously high, and yet the service they deliver is terrible. My cottage has been closed all winter. The power is off. Click on the main breaker, and yet they charge over $100 for delivery on my bill. Why? Because they can. They want the money. Glub. Burp. So you don't want the government regulating power, and there are ways of privatizing power, and the Ontario Tories found one that essentially leaves it in a quasi-monopoly situation where customers are helpless, prices are unreasonable, and you can do nothing about it. The government says, oh, it's not us, we privatized it. And the company says, well, we got the regulatory framework, and now we know what's best, and wah, wah, wah. And what are you going to do, take your business somewhere else? That's what you don't want. The Ontario Liberals are basically having a fire sale because they're so desperate for money. The Ontario Tories are opposing it because they're unprincipled populists when opportunity seems to be knocking. It's right to privatize it, but really privatize it. And have regulations that ensure access to the grid so that every customer can reach every company, not so that the government is controlling the price, the method of production, or anything else connected with consumers and producers making a deal. If you need environmental regulations, create environmental regulations. If you need safety regulations, create safety regulations. If you need to use eminent domain to set up power transmission lines, use eminent domain to set up power transmission lines. But other than that, get the heck out of the way, let the private sector create wealth because it's good at it and you're not.
All right. Well, I hope that answers Andre's question. Folks, if you would like to play along and ask your question of the professor, maybe, I don't know, on architecture or parking lots or something, fishing.
Yeah, architecture's good.
Please go to the URL that's on your screen and everything there will be explained. Thanks, and see you next time.